The first reading is Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch your coming and going, both now and forevermore. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
If you've ever been a parent or a grandparent or a supportive friend or a carer in the audience at a primary school show of some sort, Christmas show, summer concert, anything like that, then you will get, I think, what the start of this psalm, the first verse, is saying. You know that moment when the kids all troop out onto the stage and they're all in their various homemade costumes, stars on their heads or tea towels and sheep costumes or whatever it might be. And they're all scanning the crowd. Half of them are on tiptoes trying to see over the kids' heads in front to catch a glimpse of that person who's come to watch them. I lift up my eyes. That's what the psalmist is doing, isn't it? He's scanning the crowd. Well, he's scanning the horizon, really. I lift up my eyes to the hills, to the mountains. Where does my help come from? So often the world tells us to look inside for our strength, to dig deep, to help ourselves. But where does the strength to even start to do that come from? The child has confidence to walk out onto the school stage because they know that that person is there to see them. Or if they haven't made it to that show, and that does happen lots, they know that they're rooting for them. The psalmist says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. I scan the horizon. Where does my help come from? He's searching for his strength, isn't he? He's looking, scanning the horizon for his strength. This psalm, Psalm 121, is often called the Pilgrim's Psalm or sometimes the Traveller's Psalm. It's a song of ascents, of going up. The Jews would have sung it as they made their way to the highlands of Judah, where Jerusalem was for the annual feasts. There were no real roads then, of course, only trodden paths across the valleys, along the rivers, over mountain passes. You can imagine how this psalm might have been sung by the hopeful but desperately weary pilgrim on their way to those highlands. They've been travelling for days, sore feet, muscles aching. Jerusalem, the end of the pilgrimage, seems just unreachable, too far away. And then they see the hills of Judah in the distance and they break into this song. I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my strength come from? Where does my help come from? And the answer? My help comes from the Lord, the psalmist says, the maker of heaven and earth. It's as if his eyes are scanning the crowd and suddenly he sees his Father. He knew he was there, but these moments, these times can make doubt creep in, can't they? They can blind us to what we know, and then he sees him. It's you, Lord, he says. Where does my help come from? It's you, Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. It's not a surprising answer, really, is it, given that description? But I wonder if we really get what he's saying. I wonder if we really get what he means in that line. The claim of Christianity is that there is a God who is the maker of heaven and of earth, the maker of everything that you see, hear, smell, touch, the maker of all things, and of course then, the maker of you and me. I was asked the other day from one of the kids at school via a message, who made God? If God made everything, then who made God? It's a great question. Maybe you've asked it yourself, or maybe you're a parent who's been asked it, and you've kind of said, that's an interesting question. You know how a baker makes bread? Well, we're like the bread, and speaking of bread, I'm quite hungry. Would you like a biscuit? And then you kind of go off and hide and hope that they've forgotten the question by the time they find you. Well, this psalm gives us a window into the answer, doesn't it? God is the maker. It says the maker of heaven and earth. He wasn't made. He is the creator, and we're the creation. It's not a simple concept in one way, because we think with our human lenses on, as we always do. We're human, so we think of God in human terms so often. And everything is made at some point. You know, that idea of the bread and the baker. Well, the bread is made by the baker, but of course the baker was made as well. The baker had a mum and a dad in some way. But the Bible starts, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. God isn't a creature like us. He has no creator because he was never created. He always has been. Since before the beginning, eternity past to eternity future, the maker of heaven and earth. And when we get that, where else is our help going to come from? He's the source. He's the center. And yet we get to lift our eyes to him and call him our Father. And so this psalm continues, and it starts to describe this maker, this creator, this Father in more and more detail. The psalmist says, he will not let your foot slip. I wonder if you've ever been part of helping a baby start to learn to walk. Maybe you're a parent or a grandparent, or again a friend who has a friend with a baby, and you've been in that position. We were watching old videos this week because Lydia, our eldest, turned 13, and apart from how tired I looked in most of the videos, which my children very kindly pointed out, I noticed that what she did when she was learning to walk was what all babies do when they learn to walk. They pull themselves up on you, don't they? They grab your finger or your leg or your arm and they launch out. They take intermittent steps, yes, because they're going, putting a lot of effort into lifting up their legs and making them work in a way that they haven't worked before. But they don't think twice about the thing that they're holding and how steady it is, do they? They grab your finger and they launch out. There's no sense of weighing up whether you're going to let go or whether it's safe to put their full weight on you. The psalmist is saying here, he will not let your foot slip. And he says it with as much certainty as the baby grabs their parent's finger when they're launching out into walking. He will not let your foot slip. Of course, as he carries on, as this psalm carries on, the analogy of me as a dad starts to drift a bit and starts to fall down, because the psalmist says, he who watches you will not slumber. He will neither slumber nor sleep. Now, I've fallen asleep mid-sentence reading my children bedtime stories more times now than I care to count. And so much so that they just sit waiting patiently now and occasionally prod me in the side of the head when they want to hear what happens next. But this Father, our Father in heaven, he will not slumber, this psalm says. He won't fall asleep. He won't get tired. He won't slumber while he's watching over us. And again, you can see the psalmist remind himself of this truth. Of all of these things, like in the other Psalms we've looked at, he's actually the narrator and the subject here. He's saying to himself, he will not let your foot slip. He's talking about God as one of the subjects, but he's talking to himself. He's narrating to himself. He will not sleep as he watches over you. The Lord is your shade, he's saying, at your right hand. The sun will not harm you, my soul, my inner self by day, nor the moon by night. Of course, he's using imagery there. He's not saying that the Lord is better than spraying on factor 50 ambre solaire. No, he's saying that he watches over you by day and by night, while the sun's up and while the moon's out. I love that picture of God as shade as well. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. For us in the UK, looking out the window a little bit, shade is a nice thing after we've had a hot day. But in a lot of places, shade saves life, doesn't it? The people first hearing this psalm would have got that straight away. On the long pilgrimage to Jerusalem, there would have been every danger that the burning sun would cause sunstroke. And so that image of shade becomes so much more important. And yet what makes it even more poignant? The Lord is your shade. Not the Lord will conjure up a tree to give you shade on your journey, but the Lord is your shade. To create shade, something needs to be in between the person and the sun, doesn't it? So that thing takes the heat from the sun and the person is shielded from it. Everything in the Old Testament points forward. It points us forward to Jesus. Every page whispers his name. The psalm points forward to Jesus, doesn't it? To the one who stepped in between us, and not the sun's rays, but the Father's wrath, his right anger at the sin of the world. And he absorbed it. Shading us, he took the full force on himself. So that when all of that was dealt with, when it was poured out, when he had absorbed it, we could come back to our Father. The Lord is your shade. The sun will not harm you by day. The psalm says the moon will not harm you by night. And then we get this last verse, this last stanza, the last two verses really, that sum it all up. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and evermore. And there's immense comfort in there, isn't there? But do they leave us with a bit of a question? The Lord will keep you from all harm. Is that true? Because I stubbed my toe the other day and he didn't seem to see that one coming. Or more seriously, we might say, I've been going through real pain in my life. Or maybe I'm going through something really hard at the moment. And yet this says the Lord will keep you from all harm. How does that work? Well, last year for Remembrance Sunday in church, we heard the story of Ernest Gordon, a Scottish captain who served in Malaya during the Second World War. He spent 3.5 years in a prison as a prisoner of war in Changi. He suffered horrendous treatment and horrendous conditions. And yet he also witnessed such self-sacrifice among the Christian prisoners in the camp that he writes in his biography, The Miracle on the River Kwai. He writes of such grace in the face of hardship that he, through their example, becomes a Christian. On the 15th of August 1945, the war in the Pacific ended and freedom came. And Gordon stood on the outskirts of Bangkok at that time, on that day, looking across the hills towards Chiang Kai, the camp. And he recited the words of Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. You see, the psalmist doesn't speak of a life without suffering and pain. No, this psalm speaks of a God who is with us unwaveringly and unsleepingly through it. Eugene Peterson, a pastor, author and theologian who died a few years ago now, wrote this: "The Christian life is not a quiet escape to a garden where we can walk and talk uninterruptedly with our Lord. Nor is the Christian life a fantasy trip to a heavenly city where we can compare blue ribbons and gold medals with others who have made it to the winner's circle. The Christian life is going with God. In going with God, Christians travel the same ground that everyone else walks on, breathe the same air, drink the same water, shop in the same shops, read the same newspapers, fear the same dangers, are subject to the same pressures, get the same distresses, are buried in the same ground. The difference is that each step we walk, each breath we breathe, we know we are preserved by God. We know we are accompanied by God." Our gospel reading starts to talk about that as Peter walked out onto the water, and as he lost focus on Jesus, as he forgot that truth that Jesus was with him, and he looked at the waves around him, he began to sink. Friends, let's lift up our eyes. Today, let's fix our eyes on Christ. He's the answer to that question: where does my help come from? And so we're going to turn the next song into our prayer, that we would lift up our eyes and fix our eyes on him.